Hello and welcome to Newswire Afghanistan Special. I am Jawad Tehami. Amid the accelerated evacuations from the Taliban controlled Afghanistan, the fear of further unrest in an already war-ravaged country continues to grow. One person has died after the gunfight between the unidentified gunmen and the foreign forces stationed at the Kabul airport. US President Joe Biden, while expressing his determination of getting US citizens and at-risk Afghans out of Afghanistan, has warned of terrorist attacks at the same time. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has, however, said that the situation of evacuating the nationals and the diplomats is getting slightly better and reaching stabilization. So far, 28,000 people have been evacuated from the country, which includes 17,000 by the US and 3,821 by the UK. Earlier, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson faced searing criticism from the UK MPs during an emergency debate on Afghanistan while ruling out an inquiry on the UK's role in the war in Afghanistan. He also pledged to take 20,000 vulnerable people as immigrants from the war-torn country. And to discuss this whole scenario in detail, I'm joined by Mr. Afzal Khan, Member of the Parliament UK, and Mr. Peter Oborne, who is columnist in Middle East. I thank you very much, both of you gentlemen, for your time at Newswire. I'll begin the discussion with you, Mr. Khan. So, President Joe Biden says there could be a threat of terrorist attacks in coming days and something could go wrong. On the other side, PM Johnson says that the situation of evacuations at the Kabul airport is stabilizing. Whom should we believe out of the two?
Well, actually, you can believe both of them. They're not that there cannot be the possibility of an attack, but equally what's happening is when the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is saying things are stabilizing, what it means is the rate of people they're being able to evacuate. In your early introduction, you talked about 3,500 from the UK. Actually, today's figure is 6,500 have been evacuated.
Okay. Mr. Oborne, what do you think about these two statements? Do you see any sort of similarity, or do you see they are different?
Well, Mr. Khan is right to say they are not incompatible. On the other hand, there is clearly a very bad relationship indeed between Boris Johnson and the US President Joe Biden. There's a serious attempt by the British government to accuse America of cutting and running. Quite heavy briefing over the weekend which I was struck by from within Downing Street against the US administration, and in particular Joe Biden. And so, and I have to say, and I'm not, we're not in Kabul, so I don't want. But judging from what we're seeing, I do think that the British should be better in terms of getting people out. I am very impressed by the British ambassador, Laurie Bristow, and the way he stayed behind in order to sign visas, and also the British soldiers who seem to have been doing an admirable job in just giving stability and helping people get to the airport. Whereas the Americans have to, I think from the point, and I'm not in Kabul, but the way it's being portrayed and what it looks like is the Americans are a bit of a shambles, but they may have got things together a bit more now.
Okay, Mr. Oborne, going back to that emergency discussion that was held in the House of Commons, PM came under searing criticism from the MPs. Do you think that criticism of the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister in particular, was justified?
No, I don't. Funnily enough, I paid a lot of attention to that debate, and I thought that it was a very poor debate, very poorly informed, which seems, many of the MPs seem to think that Britain should still be in Afghanistan or should return. And Mr. Johnson, whatever his faults are, and I'm a great critic of his, is not responsible for Britain's presence in Afghanistan. Mr. Tony Blair, the Labour leader, sent British troops to Afghan in 2001, and then he reinforced them in Helmand in that very badly judged decision in 2006. and I would like to have heard more. We don't want to attack anybody, and actually, we will eventually have to have a reckoning internally about what went wrong. I mean, Mr. Blair has got many more questions to answer than Boris Johnson.
Okay, Mr. Khan, what do you think? Do you agree with Mr. Oborne's point of view that Prime Minister Boris Johnson is not solely to be blamed, and it was actually Mr. Tony Blair who carries the onus of this whole saga that has unfolded for Britain in particular?
Yeah, I think the only comments I would make on the subject is there's no question who started this war in that sense. It was on the watch of Tony Blair. So there is that issue which needs to be looked at. But we cannot ignore where we are today. And secondly, you cannot simply ignore the fact that it has been a conservative government in power for the last 11 years. And there were a lot of criticism which came in the debate from the conservative ranks. Actually, it's not that it's the opposition who was simply criticizing, it's the conservative MPs themselves. And I think the heart of that argument actually is, whatever the history may be, is this what happened now? And considering the fact that the Americans have been clear what they wanted to do for well over a year. So if you know something's about to happen, you have a year's notice, and then you get caught out like this. Who's responsible? It's not Tony Blair, is it?
Okay, so why there was a call for inquiry by Tobias Ellwood in that particular debate, and if there was a call about inquiry, why the PM didn't go for that? Why did he rule that one out?
Well, look, I support that. I think it absolutely makes sense that we should have a public inquiry looking at this whole issue. So our friend, Mr. Oborne, is talking about Tony Blair. So once the whole inquiry takes place, now that also can be taken into account. But all what has happened should also be looked at. And what happened towards the end, that also needs to be looked at so that the right lessons are learned. Look, it's just absolutely incredible, isn't it, that you had the international forces in Afghanistan for 20 plus years. Their engagement on this dispute itself goes over 40 years plus. And look what happened. The rate and the speed in which this whole thing dismantled and the Taliban take over deserves questions, actually. How did we got it so badly wrong? So in that sense, I think the MPs are spot on asking for this inquiry.
Okay, Mr. Khan, I'll take this point to Mr. Oborne. Mr. Oborne, earlier you just said that Prime Minister Boris Johnson is not to be blamed solely, and you pointed towards Mr. Tony Blair. Now, when he is asked to open a probe into the role of Britain into the war in Afghanistan, so why does he rules that one out?
I have to say I completely agree with Mr. Khan that there should be an inquiry. There's so many important issues and so many important lessons to be learned. The original decision to invade, the decision then the failure to sort of bring in enough aid after that, then the decision to sort of dig deeper by going to Helmand, running up to what appears to be the incompetence at the very end. And so, of course, because we do need to leave, if Britain is going to take part in international interventions of this kind, we really do need, we owe it not just to the tens of thousands of Afghan people who had died in the civil war or as part of the occupation. We've also got to answer questions about the use of drone warfare, the questions of extraordinary rendition, what actually happened in Bagram, were war crimes committed by coalition forces. All of these things we need to look into, and I am afraid that. Although I'm sure there were noble reasons for going into Afghanistan, that crimes were committed by forces from America, Australia, maybe even Britain. And we need to be honest about these things. We need to have a reckoning. Now, we had that pretty well on the Iraq War, where 179 British servicemen were killed. More than 400 British servicemen were killed bravely fighting, and many, many more maimed. And then that's before you get on to the terrible losses of the Afghan population. Of course we should have an inquiry. It's disgraceful that we won't. And the fear is there are people who don't want their actions examined in the heart of government.
Okay, Mr. Khan, what do you think of the statement when Mr. Johnson said in the parliament that the West could not continue this US-led mission, a mission conceived and executed in support of America without American logistics, without US air power, and without American might, he said. And then later on, this particular statement and one associated with this one regarding American troops withdrawal by the PM in that very debate, the former PM went on to say that was our understanding of the Afghan government so weak? Was our knowledge of the position on the ground so inadequate? Or did we just feel that we have to follow the United States and hope that on a wing and a prayer, it would be all right on the night? I mean, how do you
I
see
think
this
one thing is absolutely
criticism?
clear. Yeah. Look, I think one thing is absolutely clear, that fundamentally we need that independent inquiry, because that will give us lots of answers that we are trying to find here and we're trying to discuss here. How is it, that you had such a huge resources poured into it, trillions we're talking about, such a huge losses on the military aspect as well, both ours and Afghans, and the Prime Minister ourselves didn't see the danger. The President of America is saying that no way the Taliban can do this, particularly in such a short time. And you have the whole system, which we've poured in billions, is dismantled in 10 days with actually very little fighting. So there's a huge catastrophe went on here of calculation what's going on. We barely got it wrong. And that needs to be looked at. And I think I would also say, probably from day one, probably fundamental mistake perhaps what has been made is try to keep Pashtun out of power when they are almost one of the biggest groups in Afghanistan, almost as a majority in Afghanistan. And having 20 years and for not to be able to incorporate them into the system probably is what has brought us here.
Okay, Mr. Oborne, you already just mentioned that PM Johnson is not to be blamed. While defending his position regarding this abrupt pullout, he also gave the statement that his government had little choice, which you already mentioned as well, but to follow the decision taken by the US President Joe Biden, who has opted to pull all American troops out of Afghanistan by the end of this month. Now, when we compare this particular thing, and then criticism comes from former Prime Minister Theresa May, she says we boast about global Britain, but where is global Britain on the streets of Kabul? Is there any sort of comparison between both of these statements? If we consider his role, that there was little choice for the Prime Minister of Britain and not to pull out just as the American troops did?
Mrs. May, the former Prime Minister, has a lot of good qualities, but I thought she was talking absolute arrant nonsense when she seemed to think that she seems to be, if you look at what she said, she seemed to be saying that Britain should be retaining its military presence in Afghanistan, which is quite, look, let's face it, is quite impossible and ridiculous, and would lead to further humiliation and loss of life. And it's none of our business really to be in Afghanistan on our own. And so I'm afraid that I thought that the attacks on Mr. Johnson, and not just from May, but from a lot of his MPs, were simply sort of dreamless. That the idea that Britain has a global empire which can intervene and in countries which have nothing, ultimately nothing to do with us at all. So I thought it was a very, very inept and stupid remark by Mrs. May.
So, Mr. Khan, what do you say about this particular thing? Where should the global Britain have been seen after such a pullout from Afghanistan? When she says that we boast of global Britain and the global Britain is not to be seen on the streets of Kabul.
Yeah.
What do you make of it?
See where she's trying to come from. Yeah, I'll tell you what I think. I think fundamentally, if you look at this whole situation and you look at the fact that you had this international coalition in there, many, including America, including ourselves, including NATO, and you had 20 years and you've not been able to actually do much improvement, then what is Britain going to do alone? It's not that attempt wasn't made. I believe attempt was made, that whether something could be done without America. And the reality dawned on them that actually it couldn't. So therefore, in that context, I think what's wrong is trying to see that there is some sort of military solution after 20 years of failure. That is naive, I think. That is stupidity. And that's why what we need to be thinking now also is, what is the role we can play? Because at the heart of all this is you have Afghan people who have been going through for more than 40 years of war and violence and this whole destruction which has taken their country decades and decades backwards. And for us to then talk about somehow we're trying to liberate them, we're forgetting actually in the 60s they were far more liberated than what we see now. So we have actually helped to take them backwards. And at least what we can do now is stop playing around with this military game, stop pumping in more weapons in there, and try to help to stabilize Afghanistan, help to stabilize this inclusive government in Afghanistan, so we can have peace. And through peace will become prosperity for Afghan people as well, which will also help us in the West. The truth is, we can keep having this high moral ground. The truth is, in the West, we've seen how we cope with refugees. We've seen what happened with the Syrian refugees and the huge tension which was created in the whole Europe throughout. Now, can we handle this millions more? I mean, how does that help? So I think we need to refocus in the direction which is at the heart of it. How can we bring about peace in Afghanistan, peace through inclusive government in Kabul?
So, Mr. Khan, when you talk about the refugee problem that has risen, of course, after this particular turn of events over there in the war-torn country, so PM Johnson announced to take in 20,000 Afghan refugees. So that has been criticized by other lawmakers as well, like Ian Blackford from the Scottish National Party, who has branded it as woefully inadequate. How do you look at it?
I think it is. It's true. And the reason is this. Look, already if you look at the neighbors, if you take Pakistan, take into account Iran, millions of refugees already exist on those lands. And then on top of this, what is happening now is there are tens of thousands, again, pouring into Pakistan. Something like 200, 300,000 are at the border of Pakistan. Now, we're talking about 20,000, but you've got to break it down. When we talk about in Britain 20,000, what it means is 5,000 this year. So what do you expect the rest of the refugees to do? Is that enough? And then it's not enough. And therefore, again, instead of putting so much energy onto this front, I think we should put more energy in stabilizing Afghanistan so that refugees don't feel the urge to actually leave their own motherland, their own country, And then you're not into a situation where countries like Pakistan and Iran are ending up with millions more, because that's going to be huge and it's likely to have a knock-on effect on these countries as well, and which we're going to then have to deal with. So why is that sensible? I don't think it is sensible.
Okay, Mr. Oborne, what's your take on this particular thing of the refugee problem that is occurring after the unfolding of events in Afghanistan, and since Prime Minister has announced to take in 20,000 Afghan refugees? He has been very clear that those people who are vulnerable, and in a statement he also said that we owe a debt of gratitude to all those people who have worked with us to make Afghanistan a better place over the past 20 years. Many of them, especially women, now urgently need our help. And that is what he said. So don't you think there is a discrimination? I mean, why not consider all Afghans equally if they have to take somebody in as an immigrant?
Well, I think there are two ways of looking at what you're saying. The first is I'm very skeptical. Mr. Johnson has not got a great record for making honest or meaningful statements. And there's been contradictory messages from his government, from the Home Office, with the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, have been sort of sending out messages that they don't want refugees. And so exactly 20,000, as Mr. Khan says, it's 5,000 a year. It's not that many. But of course we should take refugees. We have an enormous moral responsibility. But at the same time, and again, I completely agree with Mr. Khan, we must play a role in stabilizing the country. Now, that means not cutting off international aid, as Britain has done recently. It's also, I very much hope that sanctions, which are used as a way of punishing countries, which are already very poor very often, and making matters even worse. I really hope that we don't go down that, although the international community must be really careful about going down the sanctions route. The next thing I think is that we have to take seriously the remarks made by the Taliban leadership about inclusiveness, that this is not the sectarian, bigoted Taliban of 25 years ago. This is a much more sophisticated leadership which wants to strike deals and accommodation and wants to honor women's rights and all of these things. And I think we need to give as much help as we can to stabilize the country.
So, Mr. Oborne, when Ian Blackford talks of taking in refugees and he brands it as woefully inadequate, the 20,000 figure that has been given by the government, he goes on to say that at least 35 to 40,000 refugees should be taken in. So, I mean, comparing these both numbers, what do you say?
I think Mr. Blackford may well be right. I think it's slightly meaningless. We just sort of juggle around with numbers. Britain should be generous. We've been in Afghanistan for 20 years. A lot of people have depended on us, relied on us, and now we've, not I think through our own fault, it has been an American action, not a British action. And I do believe the government, when it says that it tried to urge the Americans to act more judiciously, but we owe a strong duty, a moral duty, the people of Afghanistan who trusted us.
Okay, Mr. Oborne, as you just already mentioned something related to humanitarian funding or the international aid, PM Johnson has announced to double it up to £280 million. And he also said that the country will commit £500 million, 586.6 to be exact. I'm just curious, what would be the mechanism in order to deliver that humanitarian fund? Because at the same time, PM Johnson is of the view that when he says about the recognition of the Taliban government in Afghanistan, he said it would be a mistake for any country to recognize the new Afghan regime prematurely or bilaterally. So in order to deliver that aid or humanitarian fund, what could be the mechanism?
Well, I hope that the British ambassador, Laurie Bristow, has stayed manfully in Kabul, and I hope that he will remain. I don't think we should withdraw our diplomatic or our representation, and nor should we, the wonderful people who are delivering aid and know the country on the ground, they should stay too. I think it's very premature to pull out international representation. I feel, as a Briton, I feel a sense of real pride about the way that the British soldiers and diplomats have stayed in Taliban-controlled Kabul, and I think they've done a great job, and I think they should carry on. Should stay there unless there really becomes reason to go. And nothing that the Taliban has done so far has threatened them physically or threatened the work they do.
Okay, Mr. Oborne and Mr. Afzal Khan will continue the discussion from this very point, but right after a short break. For that, stay tuned. Welcome back to Newswire, Afghanistan Special. I'm Jawad Tehami, and in today's Newswire, I am joined by Mr. Peter Oborne, who is author and columnist in the Middle East Eye, and Mr. Afzal Khan. He's the member of the parliament in the UK. And before going on the break, we were discussing about the humanitarian funding that has been announced by Prime Minister Johnson for the war-torn Afghanistan. Mr. Khan, you heard what Mr. Oborne has to say. I'm again curious. I just want to know your point of view. How do you think the UK government would engage with the Taliban if they have to deliver whatever the amount they have promised to in terms of the humanitarian funding for the Afghan people?
Well, my first point would be that, look, we are in a difficult position when the government has cut the 0.07% which we spent on international aid. And what Prime Minister has already offered actually just takes us back to where we were in before. So it does not take into account the whole disaster that is unfolding before our eyes. And my second point is that, look, we need to have our ambassador there to avoid further difficulties and suffering of the Afghan people. Look, there's a famous saying of Churchill that when he talks about war, and then he said, Joe idea. So having discussion is the key now. We've had 20 years of the war. And the Afghan people have had more than 40 years of the war. So there has to be this opening of these channels. So the way forward, I think it has to be that we need to build a coalition not for a war, but for a peace. And for that, I think is where the energy needs to be going. And that also means we actually need to be reaching out to other regional players. They need to be brought in. And through that, we can have almost some sort of a minimum standard we expect from the Taliban-led government now in Afghanistan. We all must understand, look, Afghanistan is not Switzerland, so don't make expectations from Taliban that they'll turn Afghanistan into that. Now, that's going to be a long, long way. So at the moment, it has to be focused on the minimum civilized standards that we expect, which we think will be actually in interest of the Afghan people themselves. It's that human rights that we want to protect. I think once we are clear with that, then what we need to do is pull our energies together to build Afghanistan.
So, Mr. Khan, there had been some contradictory statements by the people in the government, like, for example, Prime Minister Boris Johnson saying that it would be a mistake and the Taliban should be judged by their actions and not words. And then when it comes to the head of the British Armed Forces, General Nick Carter, he said that Taliban could be more reasonable this time and they should be given a chance to govern. And then we talk about the Defense Secretary's statement. Earlier, he hoped that we would likely engage with the Taliban if they come into the government. But later on, now he has said that terrorism and poverty could increase in that country. How do you compare all these statements? Do you see lack of cohesion or understanding about the current scenario that is unfolding in Afghanistan among the top tiers of the British government itself?
Well, I think I would simply say this way, that General Carter is head of our armed forces, someone who's been engaged with this whole issue on the ground, not more than politicians. So I would respectfully suggest that we should be listening to what he's saying. And the political leadership then needs to be in line in order to take things forward. Otherwise, what choices have we got? Do we want to end up having more conflict in Afghanistan? Is that where our interest lies? Or our interest lies in seeing a peaceful Afghanistan? These are the fundamental two choices which are out there. And if we agree that it's the peace aspect, which is actually better way forward for everybody concerned, for the Afghan people, for the neighboring countries, and for us in the West, then surely we need to put our energies in that direction.
Okay, Mr. Oborne, what do you think what the Brits should actually believe? They should go with the statement of Prime Minister Boris Johnson, or should they believe in the statement of the head of the armed forces, General Nick Carter, that the Taliban should be given a chance to govern themselves this time around, and because they might be reasonable this time around? What do you say?
Yeah, I quite agree with Mr. Khan. Nick Carter is an outstanding chief of staff. He's a very, very impressive figure, and it is the right thing to do. I think there's something unsaid here, and quite a lot of people in Britain, though not, I suspect, Mr. Khan, still think we ought to be in Afghanistan in a military way. You've got to remember how this started 20 years ago, when advancing towards 20 years since 9/11 and that terrible tragedy and terrorist act. The neoconservatives who got hold of the British and the American governments and drove what was called a war on terror, what they called a war on terror, have wanted these wars, and inflicted, by the way, terrible suffering on Pakistan in the process. And they don't, I haven't heard them admit that they have made a series of terrible mistakes and cost millions of lives across the whole region. What was very, very unfortunate, in my view, about the House of Commons debate was that the failure to recognize that the cause of international intervention, and in particular the Western presence in Afghanistan, has been defeated. This has been a victory, it has to be said, and a victory for the Taliban against basically a peasant army of barefooted or sandal-wearing Taliban, the greatest military power, the greatest global hegemon in the world. We need to reflect on that, and there's no real understanding of what. Nobody has so far wanted to ask the question: how is that happen? Why did America make itself so unpopular? Why did such a movement, which was as bigoted and hate-filled very often as the Taliban, gain the popularity that it did? And they simply preferred the Taliban to the United States. And we have to work out, that is, what did we do wrong? And we have been defeated. I mean, we are now in a new world, and we have to work with the government in Kabul at the moment. And of course, if it reverts to the kind of terrible things that the Taliban did going back into the last century, that is a different matter. But at the present, there's a sort of ineptitude and ignorance, a sort of almost bland stupidity about the bulk of the debate in the West. It cannot understand that this is a momentous moment in global history.
Okay, Mr. Oborne, coming to the statement by Defense Secretary, Mr. Ben Walls, he said that the UK would have the right to intervene if the terror plots against it were planned from Afghanistan. Of course, it was part of the Doha Deal that was signed between the US and its allies and the Taliban back in 2020, that after the troops' withdrawal, the Taliban would ensure that the Afghan soil is not used against the US or any of its allies. Now, when we talk about this particular shift of events, now the Taliban have taken over the control, but there would definitely be a lot of other groups and militia groups and insurgent groups. They might carry out some subversive activities, and they might launch some terrorist attacks against the US and its allies. So what if they are mistaken, and if we go on the face of this statement by the Defense Secretary that the UK would have the right to intervene if the terror plots against it were planned from Afghanistan, how the scenario would be unfolding in future in that case?
Well, of course, if Taliban showed signs of hosting a group which wanted to launch another 9/11, there would be a duty to intervene. But so far, what have we seen? We've seen that the Taliban has already executed ISIS leaders, I believe. It's actually showing a measure of responsibility here. Now, it's difficult to talk about the Taliban as a collective. We know there are lots of groups within it, but there is no evidence that it wants to run a war against the rest of the world. I haven't seen it. Quite the opposite. It is the enemy of ISIS. And I think that there is a lot of the House of Commons debate, was Mr. Khan was there, you'll know, was incredibly ignorant, because there was some sort of idea that the Taliban is a friend of ISIS and would harbor ISIS. It won't. They're the enemies of ISIS. And that message needs to be got across in Britain.
Okay, Mr. Khan, what do you say? I mean, would there be any chance of the boots once again on the ground if anybody from Afghan soil is caught doing some subversive or terrorist activity against the US or even the UK? So would there be a chance of the Western forces putting the boots on the ground once again?
Well, probably the simplest way of looking at this would be, if we had that will, why are we leaving when we already have the boots on the ground? So I think the chances are slim that we'll put the boots on the ground again. But the key question is about tackling terrorism. And what I would say to our defense secretary would be this. We've had attacks in Britain from British people. How are we handling that? The same method has to be applied in Afghanistan, that we need to strengthen that government in Afghanistan so that their writ can be applied across Afghanistan. I think the big danger which is there in Afghanistan is this rogue elements, the different ISIS pockets which may be there, they actually using that, if the government writ isn't strong, to then cause harm both in Afghanistan, in neighbor countries, and I would say globally, us included. And therefore, the reason why we have a vested interest in working together, building this international coalition to build peace in Afghanistan, that is our best way forward for that security that we all want.
Okay, Mr. Khan and Mr. Oborne, coming back to the very same point where this particular intervention in Afghanistan started, the then Prime Minister, Mr. Tony Blair, he gave the reaction regarding this troop withdrawal. Now, when it comes to the lessons learned, he is of the view that the decision to withdraw troops from the country was tragic, dangerous, and unnecessary. How do you look at it? I mean, does he seem to have learned the lessons after the 20 years stay over there in Afghanistan? Mr. Khan, first go ahead, please.
Well, let me actually take this head on this question. I think if you want to be fair, then you probably need to say it was Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, who then introduced to us the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden, and this whole setup that we're dealing with, the way it's evolved. That's where the buck stops then. It's not actually Tony Blair. Tony Blair has come along and carried on with this neoconservative agenda. That's, I think, what would be more fair.
Mr. Oborne, what's your take on this?
Of course, it is true that the British and the Americans were supporters of an early version of the Taliban in many ways. However, Mr. Blair, I think he started to make remarks about the situation in Afghanistan, and I'm afraid they are worthless until he acknowledges that the Iraq war, which he led Britain and the world into, was a calamity, in part for Afghanistan. And until Mr. Blair accepts that the invasion of Iraq caused all of the terrible things he's just accused Mr. Biden of bringing about, honestly, I don't think he has any right. He has to reflect on his own terrible errors. And that includes the second deployment of British forces to Helmand province after Britain was defeated in Iraq in 2006.
Mr. Peter Oborne, your point is well taken. Columnist, Middle East Eye, and Mr. Afzal Khan, Member of the Parliament in the UK. Thank you very much for your Newswire Afghanistan special. We really appreciate that. And with that, we come to the end of today's Newswire. In the next episode, we'll try to delve deeper into other aspects of the situation that is developing in Afghanistan. For that, stay tuned.